It's really about helping the students learn mathematics rather than teach mathematics. By the time they're at high school, they've developed metacognitive skills, they know how to learn, they know how the game is played. And really what you're doing then is helping them to learn and keep their enthusiasm up, encourage them. I always like to say it's like being a tennis coach or a skiing coach or any kind of sports coach. You have a person who's got some abilities, they're trying to develop those abilities. You have to encourage them, hold their hands and help them when they're struggling, but empower them, make it possible for them to learn, because human beings evolved to learn. We get reinforcement in our brains, chemical reinforcement when we learn, when we solve problems. So we are wired to learn. So we need to tap into that. And with the high school, that's probably the first time when you can really do that almost 100%. In a sense, I already said it in the sense of the athletic coach, but let me give another example because it's relevant to mathematics today. When I learned mathematics, it was like learning to play an instrument in an orchestra. You first of all, you learned the arithmetic instrument, then you learned to play the algebra instrument, then the geometry instrument, then the calculus instrument. You had to learn all these instruments in an orchestra. Today, we have technologies that play all the instruments. You're going to have to edit that bit out. Okay. A mathematician today is like a conductor of an orchestra. You have to learn how to orchestrate all of these different technological tools that do the arithmetic, that do the algebra, that do the calculus, that do the geometry. That's a different skill set from playing the instruments. You have to be able to play the instruments okay, but not well, to be a conductor. And the same is true in mathematics. You don't have to be an expert in any of the individual pieces of mathematics. What you have to be an expert in is bringing them all together through the technologies in order to solve the problems. Different skill sets, but it's still about the same topic, the same content. Absolutely. The reason I started using the word mathematical thinking, many decades ago now, other people do it too, was to distinguish mathematics, which we tend to think of as sitting down and writing symbols on a piece of paper, because for thousands of years that was the only way to do it. Now we have technologies that do all of the computational stuff. We need to think of it differently. By calling it mathematical thinking, I think we are emphasizing the fact it's not about the symbols on the paper anymore. It's about the thinking in our heads. It's actually more rewarding to do it because the human brain evolved to think. It did not evolve to manipulate symbols. That was something we had to do because we had no other way to do the mathematics. Now we have those technologies. We can focus on the thinking. That's what it needs to be about. And that's actually what makes people happier. We are evolved to enjoy thinking about things. Yeah, there's actually thousands of mathematics education video games now. Almost all of them actually focus on the basic skills, the arithmetic and the algebra and things. They provide practice, which is useful and it's handy, and people like to do that, and it makes them feel more confident. But that's not what mathematics is really about anymore. Mathematics today is about this higher order mathematical thinking. We and a small number of other video game developers develop video games that focus not on the basic skills, but on the mathematical thinking. They're exploratory, they provide students with complicated challenge where they have to figure things out, usually without any emphasis on speed. It's really about the thinking. But it's that approach of providing the students with an environment, because video games are an environment, they're a digital environment, they provide you a sort of an embodied learning. They wrap around your mind, a video game wraps this little world, and it can be a small world, it can be on a mobile device, but it's a little world in which you are presented with problems that require mathematical thinking. It's very much like airline pilots learn to fly in a simulator. Surgeons learn to perform operations in a simulator. The kind of video games we develop, even though they're on a mobile device, they are simulators. They provide simulations in which the person has to think mathematically to solve a problem. And the problem doesn't need to look like a standard mathematical problem. In fact, our games make them look like mechanical devices, because that's a very nice approach to learning mathematics. You can do other things, but we use mathematical devices, mechanical devices that are based on mathematics. And in those environments, the student has to think about the problem. Maybe they'll have to use a paper and pencil at some point. That's fine. But the whole thing is not built around paper and pencil mathematics. It's based around thinking about problems. Because we are forced to provide a lot of education online remotely, we really have to focus on what is said, what is presented, what the teacher does, and what the students do. Back in 2012, I developed the world's first mathematics MOOC. The mathematics, what they call massively open online courses. I've almost forgotten the name now because the MOOCs themselves came and went. But the process of building those MOOCs made all of us that did that realize that you have to plan education much more than we are used to, because the student is going to be on his or her own most of the time. So what you have to do is set things up so that they can guide their own learning, perhaps with help from a parent or a relative, but you have to really work it out so that the whole thing proceeds without the teacher being able to correct all the time. Because when we're in a classroom, we can see if the student's having problems, we can fix it on the spot. You can't do that if it's remote. You have to plan in advance everything that has to be done, which is actually what we do when we build video games. When we build a video game, we think the student, the player is going to be dealing with this thing on their own. How can we make sure that that video game responds correctly, whatever the student does? That, of course, is what teachers have to do. They have to think in advance when they plan a lesson. What will I do as a teacher when the student does this and that? But when it's remote, that's much more important, because you're not there to fix it if it goes wrong. You have to think in advance of what might go wrong and prepare for that. The pandemic is forcing us to be much better teachers, because we have to plan much more in advance. It's really hard work planning courses in advance. I know that the effort I put into building that 10-week MOOC I did in 2012 was many months, whereas for a regular university course, in my case, I'd spend maybe 2 or 3 weeks thinking about it and writing some notes, because I knew that when I went into the classroom, I could respond to what the students were doing. Couldn't do that in a MOOC, so it wasn't a case of 3 or 4 weeks planning, it was months of planning. The pleasure was mine. Thanks for inviting me.